Okay, welcome everybody to Chik-Wauk today. I'm Mark Hennessy, Executive Director here, and we've just had a flurry of activity. It's been a wonderful summer, particularly post-fire here, so all good news. We're kind of back to normal. We had a wonderful opening yesterday of the Anishinaabe exhibit, and lots of activities coming up, a couple which I will highlight. One is Saturday, September 5th, we have Brianne Morrison doing a concert at the Mid-Trail Community Center, Shops Community Center, from 4 to 6 p.m. on that Saturday. Music, it's an AV extravaganza also. And then Sunday, September 6th, is our Pie Social, which is the big event of the year on the Gunflint Trail. And so lots of pies, ice cream, we'll have more music, auction items, all kinds of activities going on. And it truly is an old-fashioned pie social, so come for that. It's a really good time. September 12th, John, you'll be interested in this. There's a program on geology, and then we switched to Saturdays for programs in September. So, all these programs are basically sponsored by Visit Cook County. We offer them for free. We also get support from our contributors to the Gunflint Trail Historical Society. So, thanks to all those folks that help out. It's my pleasure to introduce a good friend of mine, I can say now, Sammi Shimota. We first met, she's been involved with the 1854 Treaty Organization, doing wildlife work with them. We went on to volunteer together at the John Beardery sled dog race and other things. She's an excellent photographer. She's now working on her master's degree and doing field work on habitat and moose and all kinds of things. So I think we're going to learn a lot today. So we're really glad to have you here, Sammi. So let's hear it for Sammi.
So yeah, today I'm going to be talking to you guys about moose and climate change, and other obstacles that the Minnesota moose population are going to have to overcome if they want to be here for long term. So, just a little bit about my background. So I grew up down just south of the cities in Lakeville, and I went and got my bachelor's degree at Iowa State University. I majored in environmental science and animal ecology, and while I was there, I was also involved in monarch butterfly research. So I helped out a PhD student during the field season on her project looking at monarch flight paths through a mosaic habitat. And she mentored me on my own independent research looking at monarch larva preference for vegetation. And then from there, I went out to Idaho and I worked on an endangered species ground squirrel project. And from there, I came back to Minnesota and did some collaring wolves, trapping wolves on the Fond du Lac Reservation with the biologist there. And just after that, I went down to the Twin Cities to work on the urban fox and coyote project. So we were collaring coyotes and foxes down there. In the picture there, that's actually a koi dog hybrid. So that was an interesting find for sure. But after that, I spent a winter out in Pennsylvania collaring white-tailed deer to look at the habitat population relationship. And came back to Minnesota again to work for the Monarch Conservation Consortium, Monarch Joint Venture, different one. And essentially just did habitat surveys in the roadsides of highways all across Minnesota to look at the quality of monarch habitat in Minnesota in roadsides to see if it's a viable space to invest in and put prairie plants onto. From there, I went out to Oregon, and I lived about an hour east of Bend, and we did put some backpacks on the greater sage grouse out there to look at population and the success of clutches and mothers, and how fires and other habitat management is impacting those pet species. And after that, I finally landed a full-time job as a wildlife technician with the 1854 Treaty Authority, located in Duluth, Minnesota. And I spent 3 years there as a wildlife technician. Does anybody here know about the 1854 Treaty Authority? Yeah, so it's an intertribal natural resource government management organization that implements the off-reservation treaty rights of the Bois Forte and Grand Portage tribes. So they have an administrative crew, conservation officers that can enforce state and treaty laws. They have an education outreach division, so they get involved with tribal adults and youth and non-tribal people to educate the population. And then we have the natural resource division, which is what I was a part of. And we have biologists involved in climate change projects, invasive species, wildlife, fisheries, and the environment, and wild rice. So we had a huge array of projects, and as a technician, I got to help out on everybody's project, which was super fun. But I did spend the majority of my time there, actually collaring wolves just north of Duluth, and we used their locations as a population survey, looking at the population, and then using their collar locations during the spring to find their den and collar their pups here for a survival study, and looking at how many wolves survive to 6 months, and if they die before then, what are they dying from? Which we found to be mostly natural causes like disease. And then, and they got walleye survey, electrofishing, sturgeon surveys, and during the winters I did a lot of writing reports and picking up deer poop for a parasite monitoring project, which I'm going to get into later. But I also got to spend some time up in a helicopter on the DNR and Grand Portage aerial moose surveys.
What are you doing in the holes?
That is me. So in that hole, I was measuring the natal den for one of the wolf packs. That's where she had given birth. The pups were in a different den. We had just visited and collared the pups there. So usually in the secondary dens, I am all the way in. But this is just a good visual representation of kind of what I do out there. So now I've moved on. I'm working on my master's degree, studying deer fawn survival on the Fond du Lac Reservation. And I go out to Bemidji State University. And so this last spring, my crew and I collared 46 fawns out on the reservation, and we're just continuing to survey them. And when we get a mortality, we go out and we investigate. So it's kind of like a wildlife CSI, which is, I think, kind of interesting, but a little bit sad at the same time. But so far we've been getting some really cool data. Just as a little teaser for upcoming publications, we've been seeing a lot of bears. The majority of predation events that we had early on when the fawns were young were mostly black bears. And but once the fawns started growing up and moving around more with their moms, that switched to wolf predation. So it was a very interesting kind of shift, and we had some bobcats sprinkled in there as well. But one more thing before we get on to moose, I wanted to go over a little bit of the tribal history in the region, just because a lot of the tribal agencies in the area have a big impact on moose research and conservation. Not only today, but for the last thousands of years, they've been stewards of this land. So The 1854 treaty, kind of already went over that a little bit, but established that if the Anishinaabe went onto the reservations and they ceded the rest of the land to the state or to the government, they still had the right to hunt, fish, and gather on that ceded territory. So, like in the whole Arrowhead region, essentially. The U.S. Constitution even states that the treaties are the supreme law of the land, and they are above state and federal law. And so, even then, though, in the early 1900s, the state of Minnesota, while there was this push for natives to assimilate and forget their culture and send the kids to boarding schools, they were also illegally suppressing their rights to hunt and fish in the Lake Superior Basin in favor of the tourism that the hunting and fishing brought. And so that was not great. But during the Civil Rights era in the 60s and 70s, tribal activism was reinvigorated, and by 1985, there was a Grand Portage member that had shot a moose just off of the reservation, and he was ticketed. So the Grand Portage filed a lawsuit against the state of Minnesota because it was their right to hunt moose off reservation in the ceded territory, and that lawsuit was later joined by the Bois Forte and Fond du Lac tribes. And the tribes were successful in agreeing on a settlement with the state to confirm those treaty rights in 1988. So that agreement mandated that a new agency be formed, which is the 1854 Treaty Authority, to manage their treaty rights. And so Fond du Lac actually ended up a year later making their own agreement with the state and managing their own off-reservation treaty rights, but altogether, the 1854 Treaty Authority and Fond du Lac work closely with each other on a lot of different resource management projects. So, finally, to the moose. So moose are, hold on. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, so obviously, as we know, moose have a huge cultural significance in this area. They are an icon of the North. They're a key piece of the Minnesotan's identity. They draw visitors from all over just to maybe get a chance to see one on the Dunflint or in the Boundary Waters. And they are also a very significant piece of indigenous history and current survival. So they're an important subsistence species, not just for their meat, but for their hide and their antlers. And it's been described by band members that moose are central to the Ojibwe culture and their members. And so the impact that moose have on the Anishinaabe can be seen from long ago and to today. So, yeah, moose, as they're known in English, Mooz, Ojibwe, Alces in Latin. This means they're the largest member of the moose family, or the deer family, which means they're closely related to elk, white-tailed deer, and caribou. And female moose are called cows, and they have usually one calf every May, though the twins are not uncommon. And those calves stick around with their moms until they're about 1 year old. And mom's getting ready to give birth to another calf, and she says, okay, get out of here, go be a productive member of society. And moose, they're a very cold adapted species. They're big, they have really warm fur, and they have these long legs that are meant to help get them through the really deep snow that we usually experience up here in Minnesota. And they're also herbivores, and so that means with those big bodies they have to eat a lot of food. They can eat up to 50 pounds of food in one day, and they usually prefer to eat the leaves of young trees in the summertime as well as aquatic plants, and in the winter they eat twigs, which is actually where they get their name from, and Ojibwe, the Mooz means twig eater. And then, so in Minnesota, we used to have the majority of northern Minnesota was Moose Range. But that population has shifted due to climate change. There was a population in northwestern Minnesota, but in the mid-1990s, that population kind of crashed, and maybe 100 moose still out there. But the habitat out there it's just not the same as in northeastern Minnesota. There's a lot more agriculture, deciduous type trees, and there's just less cover, shade, and like cool spots for them to cool down. And yeah, now due to a variety of factors, including climate change and habitat degradation, the moose range in the northeast is also suffering. This graph is the aerial moose survey done by the DNR, and in around 2009, the moose herd was at around 8,000 animals, and it came down to about 50% of that in a big crash over a few years, all the way through 2013. And at the time, scientists were kind of gobsmacked with what's going on, why are all these moose dying? And now, as we've done some studies and research, we found that there is this parasite called brainworm that is spread by deer moving north into moose habitats, spreading this parasite to moose that kill the moose, and it doesn't hurt the deer. And so, a little bit of a background about climate change in Minnesota. As I'm sure most of you here understand, that climate change is not just warmer weather around the globe, but that heat at its core is energy, and that excess energy in our systems is going to create kind of a chaos, and not just that, but bigger and stronger storms. And as we've seen up here in Minnesota, we've been experiencing a drought and floods and wildfires over the past few years. And so we're already experiencing those impacts of climate change. And scientists expect those effects will only intensify in the coming years. So not just the temperatures, but the timing and intensity of precipitation is also expected to shift, with wetter springs, drier summers, shorter snow seasons, heavier rain events, and longer dry spells without measurable rain. And as you can see here, northern Minnesota is experiencing a bigger change than southern Minnesota, and that's true for northern regions across the globe. So, taking a step away from moose real quick, I wanted to talk a little bit about our friends up north. So, in case you don't know, that's where we are. And so a couple weeks ago, I was up in Churchill, Manitoba, which is that red dot here. And I was talking to a scientist up there, and she was telling me about the polar bears and the Arctic foxes, and how things are dramatically shifting for them because of climate change. She says, obviously, with this warming weather around the climate, it's warming the waters as well, which means there's less ice, and there's thinner ice on the Hudson Bay. And the polar bears rely completely on that ice to hunt either the ring-necked seals before and after their hibernation in winter. And like that's where they get their fat from and their calories to sustain them through the whole year. And the majority of those calories they get from the seals are from their blubber. So the meat, the muscle, the bones, the organs, the polar bears just completely leave that alone. They're just interested in the blubber, which is interesting to me. So the polar bears in this region, so the yellow rectangle there is the region of the Churchill population of polar bears. So there's like 20, 30 populations of polar bears around the globe. But specifically, we're just going to talk about this one. So with that thinning ice that they're seeing on the southern part of the Hudson Bay, that's obviously really impacting this population. They currently stand at about 618 individuals, which is half the population that was there in the 80s. And shockingly, the majority of that decline, 30%, has been in the last 5 years. So they've seen a pretty big downward shift in their population.
Did you say just in 5 years?
In the last 5 years, they lost 30%, well, 30% of the population that they had in the 80s. So the thinning of the ice obviously is negatively impacting the Churchill population of polar bears, but actually in further north regions, thinning ice is actually benefiting some of the polar bears because that ice up there is just so thick, like it doesn't melt at all through the whole year. So it's getting thinner now, and it's allowing them to be able to hunt those seals a lot easier. There's more holes for the seals to pop up in. And so those polar bears are actually seeing a slight increase in their population. So if any climate deniers are telling you it's actually climate change is good for the polar bears, well, it's only a temporary effect. So it's not going to be long until those northern populations are in the same boat that the Churchill population is in right now. So the foxes that live in the Churchill region with the polar bears, back in the day,
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
Do they think some of those polar bears actually migrated north? Or do they all just kind of like stop breeding?
Yeah, I think, I don't know if it's migration necessarily, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was starvation in there. There's also increased competition between polar bears. So just a week ago up in Churchill, there was a male killed one of the females at the dump site because that's just where they're at right now, that they're competing for food, scarce food. So, but the Arctic foxes that live in that area as well are being affected by climate change. Their main food source was lemmings, and those, again, back in the day, there was about 1,200 lemmings per square kilometer in that area, and today it's down to about 200 lemmings per square kilometer. Sorry, I didn't do the conversion to miles there, but so those lemmings have seen a major decline because of the new freeze-thaw cycle that we're seeing in the spring, where the snow is melting to the ground under the snow, and then it's freezing. And the lemmings, when they're waking up in the spring, getting more active, trying to feed, their main food source is that vegetation under the snow. And if it's frozen, they can't get to it. If there's a sheet of ice on top, they're not able to get to their food source. And so, and the biologist was telling me again, there's also instances where they found like a whole family of lemmings drowned because there was such a intense warming and it melted so fast that they weren't able to get out of their burrow. So that's not like maybe the driving cause of their decline, but it's just an anecdotal piece of data. But so obviously foxes, as lemmings are their main food source, have had to change how they get food. So instead of staying on land in the wintertime and hunting lemmings, they've started following the polar bears out onto the ice and essentially scavenging what the polar bear is leaving, which is almost the whole seal minus the blubber. So they're getting a pretty decent meal out of that. But obviously, as the polar bear, the ice is thinning, the polar bears can't get out there, the foxes are going to have to figure something else out if they're going to survive in that region. So, anyways, back to Minnesota. Climate change is also affecting our moose. Maybe not quite as significantly as those polar bears are going to see, but scientists agree there's no one reason why the moose are declining or just struggling right now. The population's actually quite stable. As the graph that I had up here a little earlier, they had that major decline between 2009 and 2013, and then it's pretty stable since then. But usually you would expect with a big decrease like that, maybe they would start coming back. But climate change is obvious, not just climate change, but it's just kind of the overarching driver of other factors that are causing moose to struggle in northern Minnesota, which, so climate change is pushing a higher parasite load in these moose in terms of brainworm and winter ticks and liver flukes. It is increasing their heat stress in the summertime, so they're not able to eat as much. They have to go rest and shade. And then it's also producing a poor habitat for the moose in Minnesota. So brainworm, what is brainworm? It's a parasite whose primary host is the white-tailed deer, and it lives in the layer between the brain and the skull, and that's where it reproduces. And once those parasites' eggs hatch in that tissue, they make their way into the bloodstream of the deer and take that until they reach the lungs. And they get into the lungs of the deer, which the deer then cough them up and they swallow them, so they end up in the digestive tract of the deer, and they poop them out, and the larvae are on the outside of their pellets. So when a gastropod, like a snail or a slug, comes along and it climbs over that infected parasitic poop, those parasites then go into the gastropod and are able to complete their life cycle until another deer or moose or elk or caribou comes along and eats that infected snail. And it kind of starts all over, except in moose, the parasite cannot reproduce, and so instead of hanging out in the tissue layer between the brain and the skull, it starts boring into the brain, causing a whole host of neurological issues, like lack of sensory perception, deafness, weakness, paralysis, and eventually it will kill the moose. And it's kind of just like a matter of time, and some die faster than others. It's just up to the parasite, I guess. But
So
yes.
are gastropods always on the menu for moose? Or is it
They-
just a random browsing?
yeah, it's just they're randomly browsing, and they're, these little snails, I don't know if you've ever seen a snail in Minnesota. There's not like a ton, but they're small. And I mean, I'm sure you've seen slugs. Those are pretty abundant, especially when you're camping and they're on your tent. But yeah, so we've Seth Moore, the biologist out of Grand Portage, has been researching moose for the past couple decades in northern Minnesota, and has found that about 30% of the moose die directly from brainworm.
Does that also apply if you go farther north? Moose populations in Ontario or Alaska?
Yeah, so like I don't know as much about the Canadian
You don't have white-tailed
moose.
deer going that far north, so.
They do actually. They do still have some deer. So do like habitat. You have the Great Plains and stuff where they can maybe survive easier in compared to the boreal forest. But deer use cities and towns as like kind of a island, and they're able to survive there a lot easier than they are outside in the woods. But they do still, I don't know to what degree their brainworm is affecting their moose population, but I'll have a map up here in a second from this range. It's probably not going to be as dire as we're seeing in Minnesota right now, but moving on to the other parasite that really is having a hard time on moose, winter ticks. So in the springtime, a female adult winter tick will take a blood meal from the moose, and they will drop off in March or April to go lay about 3,000 eggs in a leaf litter if there's no snow. And once those eggs then will hatch in the fall, and those little neonatal ticks will climb up onto the vegetation, and they'll start questing for animals coming by, and they'll link up with 1,000 other little neonatal ticks. So if one catches on a moose, they're all coming with. And that's how And that's how these winter ticks survive through the winter, is on an animal. All the others that don't make it die in the winter time. And so those nymphs will stay on the moose through the whole winter, developing into an adult and doing their tick stuff. So just one adult female tick takes 1 milliliter of blood before for the blood meal before she drops off the moose, which isn't a lot for just one tick. But scientists up here have found moose with over 70,000 ticks, sometimes up to 100,000 ticks. So it's like, it's pretty bad. I didn't put a photo of them on here. But when you have like just 1,000 adult females, just 1,000 of them will take a whole liter of blood. And so that's going to cause a lot of the moose to become anemic. And that will put a lot of stress on moose, especially if they're trying to develop a calf. And the combined effects of the blood meals taken by all those ticks, sorry, I already covered that, become anemic, which is just, anemic means they lack red blood cells to carry that oxygen throughout the body, so a lot of the organs are oxygen deprived. And attempts to try and groom off these ticks, moose are not very good at it. They spend a lot of excess energy rubbing up against trees and rocks, and that's breaking off a lot of their fur. And all that loss of hair is going to cause, could potentially cause them to become hypothermic in the wintertime. And I mean, not only that, they're spending energy and time that they could be browsing, and it's causing them to continue to lose weight and puts more stress on them throughout the winter.
So that's a cow in spring having lost.
Yep. Yeah. So that's exactly, and some people will call these ghost moose because they're so white after losing all of that brown fur. And so it's actually, I mean, pretty common if you see a moose around here in springtime, or even down by Two Harbors. Last spring I saw a cow and a calf pair, and they just had big patches of hair that was just gone.
But it grows back, or no?
It'll grow back, yeah. Yeah, so the ticks fall off in the springtime, the ones that are causing all this damage. And so they'll be, tick free until the other ticks start hopping on them, but it's not going to be nearly to the extent that the winter ticks infest the moose. So with climate change, it's only going to make this problem worse. More deer are going to come up, and the deer don't have as much stuff to do with this, but the warmer temperatures will cause the snowfall to be later in the fall, which gives those ticks, the neonatal ticks that haven't yet caught onto an animal, more time to do so. And then in the springtime, when those adult females are dropping off to lay eggs, if there's snow on the ground, they die, or if there's not, they have, they'll be able to lay their 3,000-ish eggs and just increase that winter tick population for the next season. And actually in Maine, winter ticks are their #1 issue. It's caused, in 2002, they reported that 90% of their moose calves died from ticks. The calves are more susceptible just because they have a higher metabolic demand relative to the adults. And they also don't have that fat storage built up like the adults do because they're spending so much energy growing. So just all that blood loss in the calves and losing that fur and having to spend more energy heating themselves to stay alive doesn't actually ends up killing them. But one of the reasons why Maine has such a terrible tick problem is because their population is about 60 to 70,000 moose in this whole state of Maine. So one of the management practices they're going to be implementing soon is increasing hunter permits and essentially thinning the herd in attempts to draw back that tick population and essentially just make a healthier moose population overall so that the juveniles will actually be able to survive into adulthood.
That's good. Has anybody worked out the logistics of like some sort of a tick prevention medication?
Yeah, so
Seems daunting.
yeah, so with like tick things and medications, like I'm sure a lot of your dogs, people have pitched, hey, why don't we put a tick collar on the moose when we capture them? And capturing a moose costs like over $1,000 to do. It's really expensive, and a lot of times with those medications you have to reapply every so often. And when you have that many moose and a budget, it's just not feasible. And you'd have to do it to, the majority of the population for it to make a difference overall. So that's the hard part about, trying to do it with medications, I guess. Yeah. Unfortunately, it's not, it's just not what, you can't do it. But with deer, climate change is beneficial to them, especially in the northern part of the range up here. And so historically, they haven't been able to survive very well in northern Minnesota. Their coat's just not thick enough, can't keep them warm enough, and their legs are too short to get through the snow in an energetically not too costly way. So the harsh winters really are, of northern Minnesota, are the limiting factor of the deer population. It's what knocks them back when you have a really harsh winter. You see the deer numbers drop. But now as we see a decreasing severity in our winter weather up north, the region is becoming a much more habitable spot for deer. And as we already covered, deer spread brainworm, and they also transmit a parasite called giant liver fluke, which lives in the liver of ruminants, and we haven't found it to directly cause the death of any moose, but it does decrease their overall health, and it reduces their immune system's ability to fight other diseases or parasites. And so in this graph here, it shows the moose population relative to the brainworm and giant liver fluke prevalence in the deer population. So this is what I worked on in 1854, looking at how the deer, this is specifically the deer in moose range, how prevalent it is in the population, because we can't directly track that in moose without going into their brain and finding those worms. So, the blue bars are supposed to essentially represent the deer population. It's actually hunter-harvest. Minnesota doesn't directly survey the the deer population, and it just uses hunter-harvest to essentially look at the trends in the population, even though it's not the perfect metric because there are less hunters hunting deer every year. So it's taken with a grain of salt, but obviously this is a huge decline that we're seeing. And which is interesting, because I was just telling you that climate change is making Minnesota a better spot for deer. But it's a little more complicated than just warmer weather and less snow. So the main reason why we've seen this decline in deer, and this is, sorry, I don't have more, but essentially it's just kind of been previous to 2017. It did decline a bit in the early 2000s, just a little stable, and then it's kind of declined again. But it's the major driver behind this decline, along with a few of the severe winters in there, is timber harvest taking the good overwintering habitat of these deer. So logging for deer and moose can be beneficial for them in the summertime. It gives them nutritious young trees and food for them to snack on, but it's been taking away their overwintering habitat. So up in Minnesota, at least kind of the southern extent of the Northeast, there used to be deer yards of over 1,000 deer, they congregate together in the wintertime. Just extra surveillance for predators was positive. They would be able to create trails in the snow so they don't have to trudge through themselves all the time. But we just don't see that anymore. Deer still congregate, but not nearly to the extent of the numbers that they used to see. So obviously there's still a lot of conifer habitat up in northern Minnesota, but it's the low and the mid-level stand that has changed, and and that's just what's impacting the overall overwintering health of the deer. And that just kind of subsequently affects their fawn development and milk production and general population health. So it sounds like it's a good thing, almost, hey, less deer maybe.
Which is P. tenuis and F. magna?
Yes, sorry. So the P. tenuis is brainworm, that's the Latin name, and then giant liver fluke is F. magna. So as you do see here in this graph, brainworm declined with the deer population, which is kind of the idea of like, hey, yeah, let's keep the deer numbers low, because even if the prevalence is high within the deer population, less deer on the landscape to potentially spread it to moose is beneficial. Interestingly enough, we've seen a pretty stable giant liver fluke presence in the population. That's not really changed much, but yeah, we are starting to see an uptick in the deer population again with the couple of mild winters we had. But yes, the overwintering habitat contributing to deer decline is also not really great for the moose. Oftentimes they share the same overwintering habitat. So this map here is a range of the moose in North America. So as you can see, we are the very southern extent of moose down here, and they're a very well adapted species to winter. However, with warming winters, they're going to be pushed north to find that cooler habitat, as they can't stand the hot summer days. The moose experience heat stress usually around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. It's not a hard line because the humidity, the wind, the direct sunlight is all going to affect how hot it's actually going to feel outside. So 70 is more just kind of like in the middle spots, I suppose. But heat stress, when a moose is overheated, it increases their metabolism, their heart rate, their respiratory rate, and it reduces their food intake. I don't know about you guys, but when it was really hot for those, 4 days this last summer, I wanted to eat less, because eating food, it generates heat in your core, and so it's just like one of the ways for your body to unconsciously stay cooler. But to avoid heat stress, moose will change their behavior by resting more during the day, eating less overall, and they go off and they find the cool shady spots, which are either forests that have a high and dense canopy, so it provides a lot of shade, or more wet spots like in the spruce bog swamps. And so, and some people are predicting that they're going to become more of a nocturnal animal, so they'll be doing most of their activity at night when it's not super hot outside.
Has the moose really declined that much in Wyoming? Because I remember I took a trip out to Wyoming one year, and we counted 30 moose along the way to Jackson Hole.
Yeah, I was out in Jackson Hole last year and I saw a bunch too. I think that maybe this map isn't the most detailed, but also this is more like the core moose range. So there's moose. Well, I guess there is a little bit here. There's moose in North Dakota. I've had friends send me videos of moose running along the highway down in southern Minnesota here. So they roam. It's not like they see this line and they're like, oh, can't go any further. So
There's a moose in Nebraska that was tracked all the way up to northern Minnesota.
Yeah.
2 summers ago, I think.
Yeah,
People
so,
filming it and posting it.
right,
It was
yeah.
fun.
So, I mean, yeah, it's not a hard line, but this is kind of like the prime habitat for moose. And yeah, you're gonna get pockets in Wyoming where they are also able to thrive. And this here is a chart that was created by the 1854 Treaty Authority and some partners as part of their climate change and vulnerability assessment adaptation plan. So this is looking at indigenously important species and how they're going to be affected by climate change. So on this side we have the adaptive capacity of species, how well they can change to adapt to a warming climate, and then also sensitive, how much are they going to be affected by this. And as you can see, moose are not particularly hopeful on hopeful spots, so not only is the species themselves going to be hard-pressed to thrive in a warmer climate, but their foods, one of their main food sources, the aspen, and important summer and winter habitats are also going to be severely affected by climate change. And so, yeah, currently Minnesota lacks really abundant and quality habitat for moose. And biologists believe that it's one of the leading reasons why the moose population isn't making a comeback. And so decades of fire suppression and inadequate species being replanted in their place as a monocrop after logging has contributed to this issue. And the ecosystem in the Northeast has evolved with fires for tens of thousands of years. It was managed not only by, naturally by lightning strikes and such, but also the indigenous people that were here set fires to forests to manage for species that were important, like moose. So this, tens of thousands of years, and this is how, our environment has turned out, and just in 100 years of no fires, it's kind of destroyed it. But fire can be good. So often we think of wildfires as a tragedy. I mean, just this last summer, the Boundary Waters was on fire. A lot of it was on fire, and everyone was sad. I was. It's a beautiful area. Fire's not pretty. At least the after effects aren't. But give it a few years, and fire is just a reset button for the ecosystem, and it's necessary for many species to regenerate and reproduce, and a lot of those species will grow back recharged and stronger. A lot of the nitrogen from the ash and other nutrients are really beneficial for the soil, and what comes from the soil benefits everybody, and the food web would love that. So wildfires do have positive effects for moose in the long term. Not only does it create nutritious new forage for them about 3 years after it comes through, but it also kills the winter ticks and the slugs and snails that are carrying the brainworm. So it'll give them a break for about a couple of years. However, our over a century of fire suppression has created a large buildup of fuel. And on top of that, we've got the outbreak of the spruce budworm, which is causing the death of millions of firs and spruce trees, which I don't know if you guys ever set your Christmas tree on fire and bonfire, but it kind of it's really hot and it's intense, and having thousands and millions of those out there on the landscape doesn't help with necessarily the purpose of the fire, I guess, in the ecosystem. So it's just, and then you add in climate change with higher temperatures and more drought, you get these really intense fires that sometimes might do more harm than good, actually. So when they burn really intensely, they kill these big mature trees that are supposed to be able to survive fires. And the jack pine, those seeds need fire to germinate and then grow new trees. But those fires, when they're too intense, they don't germinate the seeds, they just burn them up. And so, like we saw with the campfire near Duluth a couple years ago, that fire burned so hot that it just kind of left nothing left to regrow and reproduce there. So the Forest Service actually went out there and hand planted some plugs, some trees out there. So it's coming back, but unfortunately some of the fires can get too hot. But that's why, prescribed fires by the Forest Service are quite ideal, and so if the fire does come back through there, it's not going to burn nearly as hot as a wildfire would. So, yeah, I mean, moose will benefit from wildfire. Peak time is about 3 to 10 years after that fire. And unfortunately, as I would assume you and I might like, wolves are not innocent in the moose population situation. So we do have, we found that, or researchers have found, about 30% of adult moose are killed by wolves every year. And between 2013 and 2017, the DNR collared and tracked 173 adult moose. And in that time, they did find wolf predation accounted for 32% of moose death. And the researchers, after the collar gives them a mortality signal, they go out and investigate as soon as possible. And for 44% of those wolf predations, they found that 44% of them of those moose were predisposed with an illness or disease. Or take infestation of brainworm. Pneumonia was another one, but that's what we kind of call compensatory mortality as a term for predation. When an animal who has a disease or illness is predated before that disease or illness would have otherwise killed them. And so, again, yeah, bringing back 44% of those moose that were killed by wolves were predisposed, but the rest of the moose that were killed by wolves were too far consumed for the biologists to determine if it had some sort of health problem that would predispose it to predation. So I would expect that compensatory mortality rate to be even higher than 44%. But that's just kind of like ecosystems and what wolves are there for, right? Taking out the old, the sick, the injured. There are concerns with additive predation, which is kind of the opposite of compensatory. So wolves taking healthy adult moose. But there's a graph here. So this is the wolf population estimates all the way back to the late 80s. I'm not sure exactly why there's big gaps, other than maybe they didn't do a survey, but I do know that they changed their survey method back in the day, so there's a good chance that a lot of that is kind of taken out because the data is processed in a different way that wouldn't necessarily correlate with the way they do it today. Sorry, that's a poor explanation for that. But, I mean, generally we see that the wolf population's been pretty consistent. They haven't seen a huge peak or decline in the last 10, 15 years. So a wolf's main prey is deer in Minnesota, and so so when we see with climate change and everything, deer moving further into moose habitat, there's going to be more prey for wolves. There's going to be a growing wolf population, likely in areas that have a higher density of deer, and so as you can see here, obviously moose don't cover the whole wolf range, but the whole moose range is in the wolf range. And if we see an increase in deer, we're going to have a higher carrying capacity for other predators, which just means that more predators on the landscape increases the chances that one of them are going to find a moose calf, which are pretty susceptible to predation. Let's see. And they found in Grand Portage that wolves already account for about 2/3 of calf deaths. They don't kill 2/3 of calves; they're responsible for 2/3 of the deaths. So it's a pretty big number. And black bears account for about 10% of those calf deaths, and others are just accidents or disease, which is not uncommon. So, does anyone have any questions so far? I'm trying to move on to the next piece here.
I was just wondering
Yeah.
if coyotes and wolves don't really cross over much, like that's wolf land there and the coyotes are further south.
So are you asking, like, is the coyote population gonna increase too?
Well, it's just, I just wondered if they shared, I kind of assumed that wherever there were timber wolves, you probably did not have the coyotes as much. But
Yeah,
I don't know.
coyotes, you're completely right. Coyotes and wolves are like water and oil. They don't get along, and they don't share habitat, but at least where I spent a lot of time studying, just north of Duluth, there wasn't a lot of coyotes, but being closer to an urban area, there's a lot of coyotes passing through at least. And some of them even breeding and pups. I found pups out there too, coyote pups. So they just avoid each other. But yeah, definitely in wolf areas, you're gonna find a lot less coyotes. And if there's no wolves, you're gonna have probably decent amounts of coyotes.
We have some here too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So I think they just, coyotes are generalists. I can go into coyotes a little bit, but the really interesting thing about their species is they were actually back in prior to colonialism. They were the song dogs of the Southwest. They lived in the Southwest, and that was kind of their range. They were nowhere else in North America. Went down into Mexico a little bit, but in the later 1800s, when there was a big predator eradication push, there's people that were starting ranches and farms. They wanted these predators out of here. They didn't want to kill the cattle. So they were killing everything: poison, shooting, bombs. It was putting so much pressure on these coyotes. Well, all that pressure was actually quite effective on big cats and small cats and wolves and black bears and all sorts of predators. But the coyotes, that pressure actually caused them to explode, and they spread. And that pressure. So when coyotes are doing coyote stuff, I guess, they're able to listen and hear like how many other coyotes are on the landscape. When you're taking out a lot of coyotes, they're like, oh, well, I'm not hearing many people, and there's all these resources available. I'm going to double my litter size, is essentially what they're doing. So they just have a bunch of babies, and those babies just keep having babies, and they essentially, that pressure caused them to explode. And essentially, I mean, they're not all the way up in northern Canada, but they're pretty far in Canada, and they're pretty far, they're all the way to the tip of South America, or not South America, Central America. And so, I mean, they've taken over, right? They're such a generalist animal that and are so able to withstand that pressure that's just like an amazing species to me. I think that's pretty cool. But yeah, if you have a coyote problem or your neighbor has a coyote problem on their farm, the best way to deal with it is to haze the coyote, because then you're not causing the coyote population to grow in your area, but also B, if you can train those resident coyotes not to mess with your chickens or your dogs, they're going to keep other wandering coyotes out. So Yeah, they just gotta train them. But, all right, so like, what's being done to help the moose in Minnesota? There's quite a few different natural resource projects that is being led by managers from state, county, federal, nonprofit, tribal organizations, and they're all working together to improve the habitat and chance for moose to stay in Minnesota. One of those projects is the annual DNR Moose Survey. I was lucky enough for the last few years I got to help out, sub in when one of the surveyors couldn't make it. So the DNR has about 435 plots across northeastern Minnesota. They do not survey every single one. Each winter they choose a random stratified group of 52 plots to survey. So it has a variety of high, medium, and low density moose range, or moose population. So, and then they also have the same 10 habitat plots that they survey every single year to study the effects of wildfire, prescribed burns, and logging. So up here is where each of these little plots is what they surveyed back in 2025, and these orange plots here are the habitat plots they do every single year. So this one's from the Greenwood fire, and I don't remember what the other ones are from, but it's one way for them to track the moose population and see if anything's helping them or hurting them. Another project is run by the 1854 Treaty Authority, so the Parasite Monitoring Project, collecting deer scat from deer within moose range and looking at it under a microscope to see if it has any giant liver fluke eggs or brainworm larvae. And that's been a really great project, just to, as brainworm obviously has a huge impact on moose, trying to quantify the impact in the year. And then Grand Portage has been collaring moose since about 2002, and so they've been the leading moose researchers in Minnesota for a long time. That's Seth Moore, the lead biologist, and then their main goals, long-term goals, is to just study how moose are using the landscape and investigating the causes of mortality. But not just those project objectives, they've also contributed to a lot of other folks' research questions in the last few, these are just from the last few years, but they've been super helpful in moose research in Minnesota when the DNR was unable to for a few years. And then we've got the Minnesota Moose Habitat Collaborative, which is just, it's run actually by the Rough Grouse Society, which is interesting, but hey, you know, if you care about moose, I care about you. They've been working to plant trees, prescribe burns, and worked on timber sales and logging, and in a productive way that is good for moose. And so a lot of those project partners are listed below, and then we've got, this is a brand new project starting this last winter between the 1854 Treaty Authority and the Minnesota DNR. And so just this last winter, oh gosh, yeah, they call it about 48 juvenile moose. And so they got 4 project goals, which include determine the recruitment, survival rates, age at first reproduction, parturition, and fecundity for the young moose in northeastern Minnesota. So essentially just kind of like getting a pulse on the reproduction rate and when they're starting to have calves. And that's kind of an indicator of habitat quality. And then provide data to improve moose population modeling, quantify habitat use of the young moose and how the habitat relates to their survival and reproduction, And lastly, identify habitats and wildlife management strategies that will benefit the moose. So it's kind of like a catch-all in a way, but with a focus on the juveniles, which is a great project. I put the lead tape on that collar. On every single collar that
Was there an issue at one time with collaring calves, increased mortality rate in the calves?
Yep, yeah, so back in 2013, the University of Minnesota and the DNR collaborated on a moose collaring project. They were going to collar neonatal moose calves, and that had never been done before. No project had ever collared fresh calves, and so they went in to do it, and they saw, I don't remember exactly what percentage it was, but a significant number of the calves were abandoned by their mothers because the researchers spent too much time with the calf, which essentially in mom's brain said, oh, my calf got eaten by these predators. And so she left them assuming it died, essentially. And the researchers saw this and were like, well, crap, that's not good. And the next spring they went in to do it again, and they had a very successful collaring season. They had 1 or 2 abandonments, but keeping in mind that abandonment is also natural, and it will happen regardless sometimes. And so there was, word got out about the large abandonment rate in the first season, and the governor of Minnesota, Dayton, at the time, put a ban on the DNR collaring all moose in Minnesota, and it was just a flat ban. So the only thing the DNR could do for those years was essentially just survey the moose from helicopters, which is why, and Grand Portage is, they are a sovereign nation. They can do whatever they want. So they continue to collar moose. Luckily, we still have that, but I don't know what you call it, royal decree by Dayton. It expired a few months after he left office, and the DNR didn't actually know that was like the rule, I guess, at the time. And so it took a couple more years for them to be like, oh, we can start collaring and studying and researching moose again. So they reached out to the 1854 Treaty Authority a couple of years ago to get this project going. So it's been a big work in progress, but I think that it's going to be a very successful project. And they expected to see a decent amount of mortality in the springtime from these juvenile moose, since it's their very first winter. However, I think they didn't see anything. Their first mortality was in like late May or something. So it was very surprising. They're young moose. We see in other projects, a lot of them die at that point of the year because it's just kind of that last, some of them just don't have enough energy or reserves to make it that just a bit longer to springtime and to get food, especially with the ticks and everything that we just talked about. But any other questions? Sorry. Okay, so next, what can you all do to help? Obviously, everything I just talked about is kind of depressing. And some people want to know, what can they do about it that's not just reusing water bottles and not using plastic straws and, biking to work or something, even though biking is fun. So one thing that you can do, with that whole juvenile moose project, they created the Northern Moose Alliance. So that's involving the DNR and 1854 and Grand Portage, who's also a partner in the project, and the National Parks, National Parks Lake Superior Foundation, which is a nonprofit. So they're calling themselves the Northern Moose Alliance, and they're doing a lot of work to do public outreach and education. And one of the things that they're calling on the community for is photos and videos from your trail cameras or from you. If you haven't seen moose crossing the road, you take a picture of these moose in March and April. This is to monitor for the effects of the winter ticks and how much hair loss they're experiencing. So it's just kind of a broad scope to collect some data and see, how many moose are experiencing this and to what degree, especially the juveniles and younglings. The other thing you can do, if you're into poop, help 1854 collect deer pellets. So if you are visiting or you live in Moose Range and you find a pile of deer scat, you can pick it up in a plastic bag and put the coordinates of where you found it, your name, the date, and the pile has to be on snow to prevent contamination, but and keeping the sample frozen, emailing Morgan Swinger. We've got drop-off spots in Tofty and Grand Marais, but I'm also going to have like a little spot for emails. If after this, I'll send out an email for just like a general, hey, here's some helpful links, a little bit of a review of what we went over, and then a reminder on how to do this if you want to get involved in collecting deer scat. I would say be aware of your surroundings. I was on the Gunflint Trail about halfway down, and we're going to Camp Minojan, and my boss was telling me, Morgan, you're not going to find any deer scat on the Gunflint. Like, there's no deer up there. There's very, very, very few. And I found a pile of scat on the snow, and I was like, no way, deer poop. It looked exactly like deer poop. I come back after the weekend, loading things up in my car, and there's a goat buying. Like, not very intelligent. And I'm like, I don't think that deer poop was deer poop. I think it was goat poop. So, unfortunately, yeah, there's that. But
and it doesn't, moose poop doesn't carry it, it's definitely.
Right. So so the brainworm and the liver fluke don't reproduce in moose.
Okay.
Right.
They just get it by that re-ingestion after they blood back into the gut. Right?
Yeah, like so the brainworm, when it'll still make its way up to the brain in moose and deer, but instead of finding a spot to reproduce in the meningeal layer of tissue inside the skull, in moose they'll go into the brain and they'll just eat the brain and not reproduce. Okay. And another thing you can do is call your local DNR manager. So a lot of these managers hear mostly from deer hunters, and deer hunters tell them that they want more deer, understandably. However, you can call them too and let them know that you want to see more moose and maybe less deer. And if you happen to live in this maroon area, you can contact Nancy Hansen. Sorry, Nancy. But a lot of the managers in the Northeast have this pressure from hunters to increase the deer population. And then they have the tribes, saying, hey, we want more moose, healthy, maybe less deer. And so they just kind of keep it stable. They're not trying to increase or decrease the deer population in the region. But it'd be cool if they maybe tried to have a little less. So you can vote for politicians that prioritize the environment. If you guys, I'm not going to say anything else about current politics, but if you know anything about history, this is a button from Teddy Roosevelt's third campaign for presidency as the bull moose button. So I thought that's so fun. And then lastly, you can gamble to help the moose. Who knows, you might win. But buying a Minnesota State lottery ticket, a portion of that goes into a trust fund every year that is then, and research projects are pitched to a committee of citizens, and those projects are either confirmed or denied by this committee and sent up to the legislature to be put in a bill and passed, and then everybody gets money, yay. And so just to kind of connect the two, so the Juvenile Moose Project we were just talking about is funded completely by this trust fund from lottery revenue, and so is my master's degree. It's obviously a super awesome resource that we have here in Minnesota, and that's all I got for you. So, any questions? Yes.
Two questions. So what predates on a tick? Who eats a tick?
Birds eat ticks, and
Not enough.
not is right.
Here, possums too?
Sorry?
The possums?
So possums, what is it? They don't actually like target ticks to eat. I think they just happen to eat things that ticks are on, and I forget exactly what it is. But possums aren't as helpful as we thought they would be, I guess, is kind of it's a myth a little bit that they eat ticks.
Maybe that's Isle Royal. No deer, so no brainworm, so the moose are more healthy?
Isle Royal is a real fun topic. I wouldn't say the moose population is healthy out there. They have these really big peaks and valleys in the population.
No predator prey on an island.
Yeah, so the moose, historically, there hadn't been moose there at one point. In the last like 200 or 300 years, moose went over. And there was no predators, and they kind of exploded, and they just mowed down all the vegetation on the island, which caused them to start starving to death. And eventually, yeah, predators came over and helped to manage that population. But again, with climate change, it made those ice bridges that the animals used to move back and forth in the winter much less common. And so the wolves started experiencing genetic bottleneck, which means there was just a lot of inbreeding because there wasn't enough new wolves coming in to help reinvigorate that population. Sorry, what was your question about that?
That's good enough. I have my last question.
Okay.
There's a place in central Ontario. The nearest town would be Cochrane or Kapuskasing. Anyway, I'm a geologist looking at rocks, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And so I pulled in one night to camp at the White Moose Campground. So how bad can this be? And it was a pretty crappy restaurant and campground. But there were white moose everywhere. And they weren't albino moose. They were just moose that had white fur. And this was in August, so it wasn't a winter tick fur. They were just white moose. Never seen anything like that before, so you need to go check that out. There was a normal moose population. There were brown moose, but like half of them were white.
Wow, I've never heard of that.
Yeah,
That's
very
crazy.
interesting.
Yeah, some sort of genetics something going on there.
Yeah.
The population rate before the crash was like 8,000. Is there any reliable historical data? Like, was that already down from historical numbers, or was it a peak?
The 8,000-ish moose, that was, I think, pretty normal, healthy for Minnesota. I mean, we already don't, the moose range doesn't dip too far down here. I mean, they kind of follow the boreal forest in this region, which is mostly in northeastern Minnesota. So yeah, I think that 8,000 number is pretty historically accurate. Maybe a little less than it was 300 years ago. I mean, I don't know too much about I don't know if there is a lot of data on the historical numbers of this. I would assume that, colonizers coming over probably took some out, but yeah.
Is there any research on the difference between when we had the woodland caribou and moose?
Yeah.
And no deer?
Yeah. So the woodland caribou is mostly an oral history. So tribal people said, yeah, that once there was woodland caribou here, and they left for some reason. I'm not exactly sure why, but I don't think there was a huge population of them down here, but you know, as much as I maybe hope or would love to see woodland caribou in Minnesota, but I know elk are also used to be very abundant in this area, and that's one thing that the Fond du Lac tribe is looking to do, is reintroduce them to that southern northeast region. And kind of the idea is in the future they'll kind of take the spot of moose as the moose kind of their range moves further north with climate change, and the elk will just be another large game species for subsistence purposes.
But you can still see woodland caribou and woodland bison in southern Ontario in a few places. And on the Slate Islands and there's Lake Superior Island, there's woodland caribou there. But it's kind of like Isle Royale, that are inbred.
Yeah,
You have to put in predators to kind of mix it up. It's a leftover from the Ice Age. And still around.
That's cool. I'll have to go to southern Ontario sometime these days.
Okay, thank you to Sammi. She's got a notebook, I think she wants your email if you want to send something. And she'll be around for a few minutes, I think, for additional questions, so thank you.